Built this house with my own hands, and I did not panic. That is what I want you to understand before I tell you anything else. When the door to the basement locked behind us, and I heard my son's footsteps walking away across the kitchen floor above, I did not scream. I did not pound on the walls. My wife, Gloria, grabbed my arm and her fingers were cold and trembling, and I put my hand over hers and I said quietly, "It's all right. They don't know what I built into this room." She looked at me in the dark and she said, "What are you talking about, Leonard?" I said, "Give me a minute. Let me start from the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand who I am and what kind of man I have spent 67 years trying to be. I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the second of 4 kids. My father worked the line at a steel fabrication plant for 31 years, and he came home every evening smelling like metal shavings and burnt oil, and he never once complained about it. He used to say that a man who complains about honest work doesn't understand what dishonest work costs you. I didn't fully understand that when I was young. I understand it completely now. I spent 2 years at community college studying drafting and construction technology, then went to work for a mid-sized residential contractor in central Pennsylvania. I worked there for 11 years, learned everything I could, and in 1987 I got my general contractor's license and started my own business. Nothing glamorous. Residential builds, additions, some light commercial work. I employed between 6 and 12 people depending on the season, and I ran that company for 24 years before I sold it and retired at 62. By the time I retired, Gloria and I had been married for 38 years. We met at a church potluck in 1984 when I was 24 and she was 22, and I knew within about 40 minutes of talking to her that I was going to marry her. She would tell you it took her a little longer than that to reach the same conclusion, but I think she's being modest. We have one son. His name is Mitchell. Mitchell was born in 1988, and for most of his childhood, he was a good kid. Curious, a little stubborn, but good. He played baseball through high school, got decent grades, went to a state school on a partial academic scholarship. I was proud of him. I told people I was proud of him. I meant it. He met his wife, Sandra, in his mid-20s. She was pretty and she laughed easily, and the first few years I thought she was good for him. Looking back, I think what I mistook for warmth was performance. I think she was always calculating, always measuring, always deciding what people were worth to her. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it is true, and because it took me far too long to see it clearly. The shift started small. Mitchell stopped calling as often. When they did visit, Sandra would walk through our house with a particular kind of slow attention that I eventually recognized as appraisal. She would run her hand along the kitchen countertop. She would stop in the doorway of the guest room and look at the ceiling. She asked, once, what we had paid for the property in 1991. I told her. She nodded in a way that had nothing to do with the answer, and everything to do with a number she was running in her head. Our property is 4 acres in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Rolling land, some old hardwood trees along the back edge, a creek that runs year-round. I built the main house in 1993 and 1994, doing most of the framing myself on weekends with 2 guys from my crew who worked for cases of beer and my genuine gratitude. I built a detached workshop behind the house in 2001. I built a small greenhouse for Gloria in 2009. Because she had mentioned once that she always wanted one, and I am not a man who ignores the things his wife mentions once. The house is not grand. It is solid. There is a difference. In the basement, I built a root cellar and a secondary storage room. The storage room has shelves along 3 walls, and a 4th wall that I finished with the same drywall and paint as the rest. That 4th wall, if you looked at it, looked like a wall. It was not only a wall. I built it in 1994, the year we moved in. I am a contractor. I build things with the long view in mind. I built that wall because I had read about a family in Ohio who lost everything when their house flooded and they had no way to access certain critical documents, and I thought, I will put a space behind there. A small space, enough for a fireproof box with documents, a backup phone, some basic supplies. I told Gloria about it at the time and she said, "You and your projects," and smiled. And then she forgot about it, and I never brought it up again. For 30 years, I checked that box every couple of years, updated the documents, replaced the backup cell phone when the battery died beyond recovery. It was not paranoia. It was the same reason I keep a first aid kit in every vehicle I own and a fire extinguisher on every floor of this house. I am a builder. I think about failure points. I did not build that wall because I was afraid of my son. In 1994, Mitchell was 6 years old, and the biggest threat he posed was tracking mud across the kitchen floor. But intentions don't control outcomes. Preparation does. The trouble came to a head in the spring of 2 years ago. Mitchell and Sandra came for Easter. It was a good visit on the surface. Gloria made a ham in her mother's potato salad recipe, and we ate out on the back porch because the weather was cooperating. After dinner, Sandra took her plate inside, and Mitchell stayed at the table with me and poured us both more iced tea and said, "Dad, I want to talk to you about something." I said, "All right." He talked for about 20 minutes. The gist of it was this: the property had appreciated significantly. The 4 acres and the house were now worth, according to a Zillow estimate he had apparently studied, somewhere between $600,000 and $650,000. He and Sandra had spoken to a real estate attorney. If Gloria and I signed the property over to him now as a gift, we could structure it in a way that minimized tax implications and also, he said, gave us the security of knowing the house would stay in the family. He said he was thinking about us getting older. He said he was thinking about what would happen if one of us needed long-term care. He said Sandra's mother had gone through something similar, and the family had wished they had planned earlier. I listened to all of it. I did not say what I was thinking, which was, "Your mother and I are 65 and 63 years old. We are both in reasonable health. We have a financial advisor and an estate attorney and a will that has been updated 3 times in the last decade. And you have never once asked to sit down and talk to me about our finances in any context that wasn't about what you might eventually receive." What I said was, "Let me think about it." He seemed satisfied with that. Sandra came back out to the porch and the conversation shifted, and we had pie and it was fine. I called our estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, who I have worked with for 15 years, the following Monday. I told her what Mitchell had proposed. She listened carefully, and she said, "Leonard, I want you to hear me clearly. Do not sign anything." She explained that signing the property over to Mitchell would surrender our rights to the home we lived in, that the tax implications he had described were, at best, a selective reading of a complicated situation, that there were ways to protect the property for inheritance purposes that did not require us to give up control of it while we were alive and living in it. We restructured everything over the next 3 months. The property went into an irrevocable trust. Gloria and I remained trustees with full rights to live in and manage the property for the duration of our lives. Mitchell was named beneficiary. A transfer initiated by anyone other than us, including a power of attorney we had not specifically authorized, would be legally void. Patricia explained all of it to me in plain language, and I understood it, and I signed the documents, and I did not tell Mitchell. I did not tell Mitchell because I wanted to see what he would do next. That is a hard thing to admit. I knew by then that something was wrong. A man who loves his parents does not open a conversation about their estate with a Zillow estimate. I wanted to believe I was misreading him. I watched, and I waited, and I told myself I was wrong. I was not wrong. Over the following year, the pressure increased. Mitchell called more often, but the calls felt like reconnaissance. He asked questions about the property tax assessment. He asked whether we had updated our will. He asked, twice, about a parcel of land adjacent to ours that a neighbor had recently sold, and what we thought it had gone for. Sandra sent us a birthday card in October with a handwritten note that said she hoped we were thinking seriously about the future. I showed it to Gloria, and Gloria said, "What does that mean?" And I said I wasn't sure, which was not entirely honest. Then, in March of last year, they came for a visit and everything broke open. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. Gloria had made soup, and we sat in the living room, and it was pleasant enough. After dinner, Mitchell said he wanted to show me something on his laptop. He had prepared a document, an actual document, formatted like a legal brief, with headers and sections. outlining what he called a family property transition plan. It was 12 pages. He and Sandra had clearly spent significant time on it. The document proposed that Gloria and I deed the property to Mitchell immediately, in exchange for a written agreement that we could continue to live there for a period of up to 7 years, after which the arrangement would be reviewed. It also included language about Mitchell assuming responsibility for property taxes and maintenance, which sounded generous until you realized that in exchange he was asking for immediate and full legal title to a property worth over $600,000. I read the entire document. It took me about 15 minutes. Mitchell and Sandra sat across from me and watched me read it. When I finished, I set it on the coffee table and I said, "I'm going to need to have Patricia look at this before I consider signing anything." Sandra said, "We've already had it reviewed." I said, "I'd like my own attorney to review it." Mitchell said, "Dad, we're trying to protect you." I said, "I know you are," which was the most diplomatic thing I could manage. They left that evening without a resolution. The following week, Mitchell called 3 times. I kept the conversation short and non-committal. I said Patricia was still reviewing things. Patricia was not reviewing the document. I had not sent it to her, but I needed time to think. 3 weeks after that visit, they came back unannounced. It was a Tuesday. Gloria and I had finished dinner, and I was in the basement doing some light organization, moving some boxes around, checking on the sump pump, the ordinary maintenance of an old house, when I heard the front door open. Gloria called out, and I heard Mitchell's voice, and then Sandra's, and then footsteps. I came up from the basement, and Mitchell was in the kitchen with a manila envelope, and Sandra was standing near the window, and neither of them looked like people who had stopped by to visit. Mitchell said, "We need you to sign these tonight." I said, "Excuse me," he said. "Dad, we've been patient. We've given you time. We need you to make a decision." Gloria came in from the living room and she looked at me and she looked at Mitchell and she said, "Mitchell, what's happening?" Sandra said, "We're just asking for what's fair." I said, "What's in the envelope?" Mitchell put the envelope on the kitchen table and he said it was a deed transfer, prepared by their attorney, and that he needed me to sign it and date it tonight. He said it in the tone of someone who has decided that a conversation is already over. I did not raise my voice. I said, "I am not signing anything tonight." And that is when Mitchell did something I will never fully understand, no matter how many years I have to think about it. He said, "Let me show you something downstairs." And he gestured toward the basement door. And he said it in the careful, neutral voice of someone who has rehearsed the next several minutes. I don't know precisely why I followed him. Maybe I thought there was still some version of this that didn't end the way it ended. Maybe I just wanted to see how far he was willing to go. I followed him down the stairs. Gloria followed me. At the bottom of the stairs, Mitchell stepped aside, and Sandra, who had come down behind us, pulled the basement door closed. I heard the lock turn. It is a heavy door. I built it that way because a basement should have a solid door, and I build things to last, and when it locked, the sound of it was very final. Mitchell said, through the door, "When you're ready to sign, knock." And then they went upstairs. Gloria grabbed my arm and her fingers were cold and she said, "Leonard, we're locked in." I said, "I know." She said, "I know." She said, "My phone is upstairs." I said, "I know. Come here." I walked her to the fourth wall of the storage room. I found a specific stone, a piece of decorative ledger stone I had set into the drywall in 1994, positioned at about hip height, slightly proud of the surrounding surface if you knew to look for it. I pressed it at the right angle, and the panel released swinging inward on the hinges. I had set 30 years ago, and maintained with a few drops of oil every time I thought to do it. Gloria said, "Leonard." Inside the space was a small fire-proof box, a folding camp stool, a flashlight, a battery-powered lantern, 2 bottles of water, and a phone. The phone was a basic prepaid cell. I had replaced it 14 months earlier and charged it full and left it. It had enough battery. I turned on the lantern and I handed it to Gloria, and I called 911. I told the dispatcher our address. I told her we had been locked in our basement by our son and his wife against our will. I told her my wife had a heart condition. She has a mitral valve issue, monitored and managed, not acute, but I wanted it on the record. and that I needed someone to come to the house. The dispatcher kept me on the line. Gloria sat on the folding stool and held the lantern and looked at the open panel in the wall, and she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long has that been there?" I said, "Since we moved in." She said, 30 years. I said, 30 years. She said, "And you never told me." I said, "I'm telling you now." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and her eyes were wet, and she sat very straight on the little stool, the way she always sits when she is holding herself together. And I thought about the 31 years she had sat next to me in church, and across from me at breakfast, and in the passenger seat on long drives, and I thought that if something happened to her in this basement because our son had lost his mind, I would not recover from it. Nothing happened to her. We were in that basement for 40 minutes. The police arrived. I heard the knock at the front door, and then voices, and then the sound of the basement door unlocking. A young officer came down the stairs, and he said, "Sir, are you Leonard Hatch?" And I said I was, and he said, "Can you and your wife come upstairs, please?" Upstairs, Mitchell and Sandra were in the living room. Mitchell's face had gone the color of old concrete. Sandra was sitting very still in the armchair by the window with her arms crossed. There were 2 officers. I explained what had happened. I was calm and specific. I mentioned the envelope on the kitchen table, which was still there. One of the officers photographed it. Mitchell said it was a misunderstanding. He said the door had locked accidentally. He said he hadn't realized we were stuck. The officer who had come to get us looked at Mitchell for a long moment, and then he said, "Sir, your father says you told him through the door to knock when he was ready to sign. Can you explain that?" Mitchell did not explain it. Both of them were taken in for questioning that evening. The district attorney's office reviewed the case. Ultimately, Mitchell was charged with unlawful restraint, which in Pennsylvania is a first-degree misdemeanor, and with elder abuse under state statute, which is a felony. Sandra was charged as an accessory. They hired a criminal defense attorney, and it took 14 months to work through the system, but the outcome was what it needed to be. Mitchell pleaded guilty to the misdemeanor, and Sandra was convicted on the accessory charge. He received probation, mandatory counseling, and a substantial fine. She received a suspended sentence in her own probation terms and a criminal record that will follow her for a long time. The deed transfer was void. Patricia had sent me the trust documentation the year before, and it was already on file. There was nothing for Mitchell to have transferred even if I had signed, because the trust structure I had put in place meant that any transfer required both trustees and could not be compelled under duress. Their attorney figured that out about 6 hours after the arrest, and I imagine that was not a pleasant conversation. People have asked me since then whether I feel grief about it, whether losing a son, not to death but to what he became, or maybe to what he always was, is something you recover from. I don't have a clean answer to that. I think grief and clarity can exist at the same time. I am clear about what happened, and why it happened, and what I needed to do to protect my wife and our home. I am also 67 years old, and I remember teaching Mitchell to ride a bicycle in the driveway of a house we lived in before this one. And I remember his face when he finally stopped wobbling. The pure surprised joy of it. And I carry that memory the way you carry something that used to be one thing, and is now something else, and you're not entirely sure what to do with it. Gloria wrote him a letter 6 weeks after the sentencing. I read it before she sent it. It was 4 pages long and honest in the way that only someone who loved a person completely can be honest with them. She said she forgave him. She said she did not know if she could trust him again. She said she hoped he found his way to something better. He has not responded. The house is quiet in the way it has always been quiet. In the mornings I get up before Gloria, and I make the coffee, and I stand in the kitchen, and I listen to the house settle, the way old wood and old joinery settles in the cold with the heat, creaking slightly, adjusting, alive in the way that a house is alive when it has been lived in for a long time and genuinely cared for. I know every sound this house makes. I built most of it. I know where the floor is softest and where it will hold forever. I know which windows stick in August and which door needs to be lifted slightly before you pull it closed. I know what is behind the 4th wall. After everything, Gloria asked me to show her the space properly, in daylight, with no emergency, just the 2 of us standing there with the panel open. I showed her the box and the contents and the hinges, and how I had set the stone. She asked me why I had never told her, and I said, honestly, that I had told her when I built it, and she had said, you and your projects, and moved on. And that after that it had simply become one of the things I knew about this house that lived in the category of things a builder keeps in his own head, not secrets exactly. More like notes he doesn't think to share because they seem, in the ordinary run of things, unnecessary, she said, and in 30 years it never seemed necessary. I said, until it did. She stood there for a moment looking at the open panel, and the stone and the shelf inside, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, you built this house to take care of us, didn't you? Even the parts I never knew about. I said yes. She nodded once, and then she said she was going to start the coffee, and she went upstairs, and I stood in the storage room for a few more minutes, and I looked at the fireproof box, and the little folding stool and the lantern, and I thought about the man who had put them there 30 years ago. Who could not have told you specifically why he was doing it, who simply believed that the structures you build should account for the possibility of things going wrong. I put the panel back. I pressed the stone until I felt it click. I went upstairs. The coffee was ready. Gloria was at the kitchen table with the morning paper, her reading glasses on, unhurried. I poured 2 cups, and I sat down across from her and outside the kitchen window. The light was coming through the hardwood trees along the back of the property, the way it does in October, low and gold, and I thought, we are still here. This is still ours. I built it to last, and it did. Some things you build for the ordinary reasons. Some things you build because you understand, somewhere below the level of words, that love requires preparation, and that a man who builds things well builds them for all the futures he can imagine, including the ones he hopes will never come. People ask me sometimes what the real lesson is. They want something clean and portable, something they can write down. I understand that, but I have spent 67 years building things, and I can tell you that the most important structures are rarely the ones that are easy to explain. What I keep coming back to is this. Mitchell and Sandra did not become who they were in that kitchen on a Tuesday night. That version of them was built slowly, over years, one small choice at a time. The first time Mitchell looked at this property and saw a dollar amount instead of a home, something shifted in him. The first time Sandra calculated what we were worth to her, she started down a road. Neither of them woke up one morning and decided to be the kind of people who lock elderly parents in a basement. They arrived there incrementally, each compromise making the next one easier, until locking a door behind us seemed, to them, like a reasonable thing to do. That is how moral failure works. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. I think about the choices I made on the other side of that equation. I did not restructure our trust because I distrusted Mitchell. I did it because Patricia gave me sound counsel, and I was paying attention. I did not maintain that hidden space for 30 years because I feared my son. I did it because I am a builder, and builders account for failure points. The outcome that night was not luck. It was the result of decades of small, unglamorous decisions, keeping the phone charged, updating the documents, not signing things without having them reviewed, listening when a professional tells you something you might not want to hear. That is what I mean by intelligence, not cleverness, not smarting anyone. Just a long, patient work of paying attention and acting on what you learn, even when nothing feels urgent yet. And the endurance part. That is Gloria sitting straight on a folding camp stool in the dark, holding a lantern, not dissolving. That is me keeping my voice level when every instinct wanted to break. Resilience is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to remain functional while afraid. We were both afraid that night. We did not act afraid, and that distinction mattered. I will not pretend the grief is simple. Mitchell is my son. I taught him things in this house, in this yard, in the driveway of our old house before this one. I remember who he was, before whatever happened to him happened. Gloria wrote him a letter and meant every word of it, and he has not written back, and she does not talk about that much. But I see it in her sometimes, early in the morning before she thinks I am watching. But here is what I know. A man who builds with integrity builds things that hold. The house held. The trust held. 30 years of quiet preparation held. And Gloria and I are still here, at this table, with coffee, with the light coming in through the kitchen window the way it always has. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything.